Hi everyone. I very much enjoyed class on Friday as we moved into a discussion of mindfulness and mediation. As I shared with you, I think that mediation offers itself as a wonderful way of bringing together mindfulness and the law, both as a pragmatic consideration as well as a larger one, moving into the real heart of what mindfulness is very much about. And so what I'd like to do is, because we didn't have as much time in class on Friday to move into some of the textual discussion around the readings, to be able to take a little bit of time and to point out to you some of the passages in the readings that I think either can offer you an opportunity to reflect on and or for me to share with you some thoughts about the practice of mediation and its connection to mindfulness, as well as the way the reading, in particular Evan Rock's reading, I think can be helpful to you as you begin to work on your papers. So I'm going to take a few minutes to explore both the big picture of why it is that I think that mindfulness and mediation come together in a beautiful way to set us up for our further discussion not only of mindfulness but also of other forms of dispute resolution. And of leadership that can play a very significant role. And leadership is what we'll be exploring primarily next week. And litigation will be what we're exploring the week after when Harley Tropin visits our class to talk about the role that mindfulness has played over the course of many decades for him as both a young lawyer and a seasoned practitioner who really has achieved the heights of success in the law. So to begin, I'd like to talk about and maybe throw out an example for you to consider of two people in a dispute. Let's say it is, you can think of this in terms of your own personal life, going off to law college or law school, in a relationship, the kinds of issues that you and somebody else may have grappled with, whether it was a parent, whether it was a partner, and whether or not to go away or not to go away, and the financial considerations or the relationship considerations, or whatever that may be. But I'm going to speak to something that's a little bit more removed from our own direct experience, but I encourage you to continue to think of this material from your own direct personal perspective and to come up with examples that are personal, because that can allow it to be even more richly felt and explored. But let's take a couple that's getting divorced. They own a home, and there's a decision whether or not to sell the home and divide the proceeds, or whether to maintain the home as a shared asset because maybe the market's rising and that makes good sense financially as one argument, and then have somebody live there and pay rent, or have a third party live there and they share the rent. Now that would be a classic dispute for which a mediator might be called for. There's two people, two different perspectives. They necessarily having difficulty figuring it out for themselves. A mediator comes in, and arguably it's a third-party neutral who's there to help the parties really facilitate their own empowerment and decision-making process, facilitate communication, so that they can resolve the dispute themselves. Now, we can take that and we can modify it and make one little shift. Instead of two different people and the mediator, so that there's three people in the room. And of course, Evan Rock in his paper and what we've been exploring is how that mediator might bring mindfulness and mindfulness practice to enhance their skills and their capacity to mediate that dispute. We could have it where there is a person who, say, wants to sell the home, split the proceeds, and there's another person who does not, but that other person is us. Right? So here we are in a dispute with somebody else. We're maintaining one position, which in this case would be don't sell the home, and then to generate revenue and ultimately sell it when the market goes up, while the other person is maintaining the position of just selling it now and splitting the proceeds. The same two positions, but now ourself and somebody else. And the ways that mindfulness can be helpful to us in perhaps more effectively managing that dispute and resolving it in a way that's more satisfying to us, perhaps to the other person. Then we can take it one step further, which really is one step closer, which would be to say, we're sitting as somebody who may be ending a relationship, and we're not sure, do we want to sell it and all the pros of selling it and cons of selling it, or do we want to hang on to it and the various pros and cons of hanging on to it? Again, two perspectives, but now embodied within one person. So I think that this is a helpful way of thinking about how the mediation process, because is there a mediator in each of those three scenarios? Yes, and arguably we could be the mediator in each of those three scenarios. We could be the mediator with two people and we're drawing upon mindfulness to help us be more effective. We can be the mediator when we are a part of the dispute to help us more effectively manage and explore the options and resolve that dispute. And we can be the mediator among our own competing interests. You can think about the angel and the devil, or two people popping up with different perspectives. Because once you decide that you've got two different ways of looking at something, or two ways of exploring resolving something, you immediately, on any dimension that you raise, are going to have two different voices, at least. So let us now look at the articles that we've read. Let's zero in on some passages, and please, I think, in light of this illustration of the coming together of the mediator and the parties, and ultimately the positions, even within one person, to think about how it is that you can read this article and other articles and almost at any point in time make the shift from the traditional way of viewing a mediation to the other ways of exploring it, even within oneself, mediating our own disputes, and how being a mindful mediator of our own disputes can be very, very helpful. And then to begin to explore how it is that this is happening all the time, that all day long we're finding ourselves in these situations, sometimes very subtle, sometimes more obvious, and the ways in which it is that the spiral, right, that the spiral is a wonderful metaphor to help us look more deeply at what's taking place, and even to understand the language that Evan Rock is using as he's beginning to, and this was written about 10 years ago, introduce the legal profession to mindfulness in the context of mediation. So let us begin with, on page 348, he says, mediator neutrality is necessary for the party's retention of decision-making power. Mediator neutrality. And give thought to this idea that the mediator and their capacity to remain neutral, unbiased, impartial, can be helpful for the parties to be able to resolve their own dispute. Reflect on that in terms of the other scenarios that we explored. What does that mean to be in a conversation with somebody else where you are disagreeing, and somehow there's a quality of neutrality or impartiality that you are bringing to that dispute? What does that mean? How does one do that? Does that mean we abandon our position, or we maintain no position? How is it that we can nonetheless adhere to the fact that we have a stake and we have an interest, and we're going into this with an articulated view as to what we want to get out of it, while at the same time having a capacity that we bring to bear that is observant, that is witnessing, that is neutral even, and impartial? And then ultimately, how might we do that with ourselves? You might think that it's easier to do it when you've got two other people, and you might even get a sense of how you might do it when it's yourself with two different views. How can I bring some sort of neutral, maybe rational, one might think, but it's not quite rational, but to bring this larger perspective to bear? But when we think about ourselves and somebody else, we think, well, that's really, really challenging. That would mean letting go of my perspective, letting go of what matters. But I suggest that by looking at it as all three of these being ultimately collapsible to almost the same situation, that idea of my position becomes more broadly recognized as many positions. And then rather than having there be something adversarial, it's taking all that's in the room and figuring out the most meaningful and satisfying option. Or set of course of options. He goes on to say a mediator's awareness of his or her own thoughts and emotions is central to the possibility of just outcomes in mediation. And so here it is, we see how he's articulating this awareness, right? Awareness of thoughts and emotions. And we talked in class about how he's sort of leaving something out. Not that his paper isn't complete in and of itself, but what are we also exploring, and what is oftentimes very much a part of the mindfulness process and practice. We are aware not just of thoughts and emotions, but also sensations in the body. And so we'll come back to this in the weeks to come, and we'll come back to we'll be learning some exercises like the body scan, which is very much about noticing and attending to nothing but the sensations in the body. But already we're doing that with the mindful sitting practice, right? Already we're noticing the sensations in the body as they arise, and as we explored in class, as they what? As they change, as they come, as they go, as they return, as they shift, and their nuance. As an aside, in class, as you may recall, we had options. We had two different kinds of apples that we could have, the red apple and the green apple, right? We had two different songs that we listened to learn from, to really bring together some of the deeper threads of mindfulness practice in many, many ways. And we took one of those apple cores and we put it on a table, on a plate on the ground so we could all see it, and then ultimately on the table before Stephen, who could be our primary observer, to say, well, what is it that's going on if we pay attention to the apple? What is it that's going on if we're paying attention to the apple? Something's happening that isn't necessarily as obvious when we're paying attention to the breath, perhaps, but is very similar. And so I make this mild segue. I'm coming back now to Evan Rock's language. The idea, though, of what we can pay attention to and what we notice when we do pay attention. He speaks of thoughts and emotions, and we're adding to it bodily sensations. He says the awareness of those thoughts and emotions and the ability to exclude those thoughts and emotions from the external process of the mediation are the central aspects of neutrality. Okay, so two things to bear in mind here. This idea of excluding thoughts, emotions, and sensations in the body, is that something that we do? I think his language is not meant to suggest that you actually somehow eliminate them entirely, but that is the language that's used, and we do want to be very attentive to language. From our own experience, and this is why the practicing of mindfulness is so important, without practicing mindfulness, we might say, yeah, that makes sense, exclude them. Then you'll be left with a more rational decision. But when we are aware of the spiral of thoughts, feelings, and sensations, when we are aware of that which is arising in the midst of uncomfortable, undesirable, unwanted experiences, we perhaps realize we can't make them go away, but we can do something which changes our relationship to them. And what is that? Among other things, is we can be aware of it, we can recognize it, and then we can begin to notice and, if you will, be present for those thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And when we get to Daniel Bowling's piece, and he talks about the presence that the mediator brings into the room and how that's cultivated, one of the ways may very much be that recognition and awareness that we bring to the arising of thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and not being so reactive. But it's the practicing of mindfulness that informs us into what that actually means and what that transformative processing really is all about. Because it's happening under the hood in many ways. But if you're going to speak to it and be helpful to readers, that personal experience with the practice is very, very important. He also goes on in this piece to say, in that passage to say, from the external process, and he's speaking to, and goes on later to say, while internal neutrality may be impossible to achieve, a mediator's awareness of his own thoughts and emotions is important for maintaining external neutrality. So he's speaking to the ways in which we might be sitting there and having a preference for one of the parties. We prefer their position, there's something about them we find compelling, and if we're not careful, that internal bias, if we're not aware of it at the very least, can lead to us not appearing impartial or neutral. That can disrupt the mediation process. So he's speaking to how it is that our internal, if it's made external, and if we're aware of bias, can allow us to more deliberately and intentionally suppress or tone down, or maybe even exclude some of the things we might otherwise say or do to help achieve that larger sense of neutrality. Now, also I think in his piece, and also is certainly part of what we're exploring, is how is it the mindfulness practice can be helpful even with that internal bias, right? How can mindfulness help not just allow us to suppress it or simply be aware of it, both important, certainly the awareness and how we choose to work with that, but also might begin to shift the way we're relating to an experience or a person, so that that bias may not express, even appear or emerge in the same form as it might otherwise. And importantly, if we think about the mediator's role with the parties, and it's just us mediating our own internal confusion, debate, conflict, that idea of external and internal really collapses. And I'm not sure that it doesn't also collapse even when we're mediating between two people. That is to say, our own internal and external bias might collapse so that we can become present and, as Bowling speaks to, really bring peace into the room in a very meaningful, wise, and compassionate way. Evan Rock continues to say, and this is I think important on page 350, and I point this out to you, I think this is where you can learn from him, or at least I would like you to learn from the paper, ways that you would begin to craft your own paper. You don't need to do it like this, and he doesn't do this perfect, but he does say, the note argues that the cultivation of awareness through meditation enhances a mediator's ability to be neutral, thereby increasing the possibility of just outcomes from mediation sessions. Okay, I think that's a fairly succinct articulation of his thesis, and that's what you'll want to be able to do also. He then goes on to say part 1 does this, part 2 does this, and works his way to part 5. I think that breakdown, which he offers, I think in a way that carries itself, lends itself nicely, informs the reader of where this is going, has an internal consistency which can be helpful to illuminate the objective of the paper and to prepare the reader for its parts, and obviously derives from his having given thought to this so that it's reduced to a 5-part articulation that makes sense. On page 353, he says, the practice of mindfulness meditation allows the development of a person's ability to recognize his or her thoughts and emotions as they arise and to make choices grounded in clearer understanding of those thoughts and emotions. So he says, in clearer understanding of those thoughts and emotions. And here I would just prompt you to consider where it is that the mindfulness practice is oriented around giving us answers and helping us figure something out by trying to figure something out, and where it is that the mindfulness practice may be helpful in having a different relationship to a situation so that we haven't necessarily had to think our way through to a solution, but because we're different in that environment, in that context, answers can flow more readily, that may be more responsive. So oftentimes when you all are commenting in your homework on the spiral or these applications of mindfulness to situations, you'll speak to how you'll stop and figure something out. You'll analyze what that thought means. You'll think about why you're feeling that way. And while I think there's a great deal to that and the importance of that, more deliberative, cognitively engaged processing of what's taking place and making sense of it, and while I think that there is a very important place within the mindfulness practice that can be carried out, we're really exploring the mindfulness practice piece as a space and as a way of relating to what's taking place that isn't necessarily in the service of figuring anything out as the primary objective or aspiration. We spend so much of our time taking whatever happens, or whatever happens even to us, and trying to make sense of it. And this really is an opportunity that we have to, rather than doing and trying to change and make something happen that's different, experience the moment in a more steady, okay way, without having to figure anything out. Now, I would suggest to you, in the service of our interest in figuring things out, that will lead to, as I indicated earlier, a more robust capacity to come up with decisions and have insights that can be even more helpful than they otherwise would be. But that's something that's important to think about as you read through this, because oftentimes even the mediator who thinks they have all of a sudden an idea and they start to want to tell the parties what they figured out and why that makes sense may not in fact be what's really called for in that moment, where the parties actually are finding themselves working towards perhaps a deeper level of communication and resolution. That is to say, that thinking process can interfere with what's really at play. He then goes on to say, a loss of mediator neutrality threatens the parties' ability to craft their own solutions. And I think that that's speaking to what I just shared. He says, the more aware, this is on page 355, the more aware mediators are of the emotions, values, and agendas they are experiencing internally during a mediation session, the more they can structure their outward behavior to dissipate any external manifestations of bias or preference. And this language, to dissipate any external manifestations, I think brings to mind, and I'd like you to consider, the spiral in that regard, right? We have an event, it's not what we would like to be, we have thoughts, feelings, and sensations, there's a certain level of discomfort, that would speak to that internal, the threat to internal neutrality, and how it is that what then happens, which is of course our reactions, our overreactions, what we may do, that now moves into the external realm. And he speaks to how we can better structure our outward behavior to dissipate any external manifestations of bias or preference. And I think that in the practice of law, we're not going to have it where somehow mindfulness or some level of insight or wisdom that we can just sort of bring to bear at any given moment is going to lead us to dissipate the internal distress we're feeling. But we are in court, and the jury is looking at us, or we are before the judge who is really sort of sizing us up, or we are interacting with a client, or whatever the case may be, we are in a very tumultuous deposition process, and how can we maintain the external appearance that serves us well and serves our client well when we are internally quite agitated and distressed. And I think this is a very common experience of lawyers, and I think that it's important to be able to manage that outward appearance and the awareness of and the practice of becoming increasingly adept at noticing and attending to the agitated thoughts, feelings, and sensations allows us to, in a way that's more conducive to our effectiveness in those moments, to perhaps even tone down the agitation, and very importantly, to really be in the service of our own well-being. Because this will wear us down again and again and again, and without awareness and the ability to sort of notice and attend, we're more likely to just repeat that, and I would suggest to you in more ingrained, caught ways as we progress through our careers, as opposed to having it be where we've got moments of discomfort because of the situation, and who wouldn't be uncomfortable, but it doesn't change us so that we become more inclined. If anything, it changes us so we have a greater capacity to remain steady in those moments and not be really pulled into and more prone to or more inclined to engage in that adversarial, unnecessary adversarial or unnecessarily provocative adversarial stance. On page 358, the way that the mediator chooses to seat the parties may impact the parties' perceptions of the mediator's neutrality. And here I just want to say, interestingly enough, how you sit when you practice. Where do you sit when you practice? Just as he's saying, have the parties sit in a certain way and have you sit in relationship to them, that's helpful. Even think about when you practice mindfulness. Where are you sitting? What is your posture when you're sitting? How are you arranging the setup of the room or the space that you're in? And is it conducive? Or is it in some ways not fully thought out and may impinge upon the rightness of that practice. We're getting close to the end of this chapter. I hope this is helpful, what I'm sharing with you, this article. But I also want to let you know that we're getting close to the end of the things I'd like to share with you. He says on page 362, the management of narratives requires the mediator to analyze and interpret the stories being told by the parties during a mediation session. Right? This is really interesting. The management of narratives. So think about the two people that you're mediating. Think about yourself and somebody else. Think about yourself with two different, possible courses of action. Narratives, stories. We talked about Sharon Salzberg. Mindfulness is being able to tell the difference between what's happening and the stories we're telling ourselves about what's happening. And so much of the positions that we have are not necessarily refined to what's really in our best interest, but really it's the story that comes along that's now influencing what we think is in our best interest. So this is saying the management of narratives. And this is something that the mediator, within and interpersonally, the management of narratives requires the mediator to analyze and interpret the stories being told by the parties. Now, analyze and interpret the stories being told by the parties. So this really speaks to the ways in which a mediator with two people will get into content. You've got the stories, making sense of the stories, helping to facilitate communication, and how we, mediating our own narratives, simultaneously at sometimes let go of the story so that we can see more clearly what's happening. And then I think our narrative becomes more clear to be able to make more effective and helpful decisions, and to make them more confidently. He then says, if neutrality boils down to a skillful manipulation of discourse, then the cultivation of awareness through mindfulness meditation can be a great service toward that end. And here he really puts it all together. A skillful manipulation of discourse. And that term skillful, I think, is very important, and one that you'll read often in the mindfulness commentaries and writings, right? To be skillful, which really means different situations, different contexts, a different approach that might be taken. And where does that come from? And it really, I think, comes from being able to see clearly what's taking place so you can draw upon your own expertise, your own experience, your own intuition, and not be rigidly confined to some earlier way that you did it that sort of worked and that you try to fit into this scenario. And I think that that would be some of the things that I find to be helpful and informative in Evan Rock's piece. I'm going to move now to Daniel Bowling's, and this will be a much shorter conversation. I think that this is a brilliant piece that you've read. Your comments on it, I think, were very, very insightful. And in the readings for this week, there is another piece from the same book of Daniel Bowling's that really moves into his experience practicing mindfulness as a mediator. And I strongly encourage you to really attend to that. We read it briefly, 5 minutes of it in class as part of the to-do mindfulness meditation practice. I hope that that whetted your appetite to read it, because while it doesn't speak to leadership directly, and it's the very last piece that I put in your packet of readings, I think that it helps to connect and transition us from this week's class to next week's class. It's also, I think, it's humorous and a very, very poignant, and it's also a shorter piece. Before I get into bringing peace into the room, just a couple of other comments on the class. We listened to two songs. The two songs were Simon and Garfunkel's song about leaves that are green, turning brown. We talked about and listened to a Leonard Cohen song that had to do with going home. And both of them spoke to, in many ways, impermanence. Both of them spoke in their own ways to things that I'd like for you to connect up. And one of the assignments that you'll have will be to listen to those songs again and to write something that really connects them to mindfulness practice in a way that resonates with you. One of the things that really is an important part of what we explored in class is adding to our understanding and appreciation for mindfulness practice by speaking to something that's happening moment by moment by moment that we oftentimes might overlook, which is that everything's changing. Everything's changing. In the song by Simon and Garfunkel, leaves that are green are turning brown, right? And that's speaking to the natural aging process, the natural process of change. In Leonard Cohen's song, he's talking in many ways, perhaps from his perspective, I'm not sure, of being much older in his life, much closer to death than to being born. He may be thinking about going home, and I think that the language that he uses in his song is explicitly focusing in this direction, but as I shared with you, he's a long-term meditation practitioner who's really immersed in this, and I think that the song, in addition to being very poignant in the regard in which it's most readily understood, can be very, very poignant and meaningful as it relates to the thoughts, feelings, sensations we have, the ways that we conduct ourselves, the images that we seek to maintain, the being able to let go of the agitated ways that we can, and contracted and defensive ways that we can hold ourselves, so that we can really emerge in this moment, not in some future moment in time when we go home, but rather coming home right now to the breath, coming home to an awareness of what's really taking place around us, and really finding the joy, the satisfaction, the richness, the aliveness, the engagement in our lives that we're living and the work that we're doing. And I think that his song speaks very much to that. So we had the apple that we put in the middle of the room, a slice of apple. And of course, as some of you noted, over the course of the hour, that apple, which could have been the object of our meditation, in fact it was for a few moments, we rested our attention on the apple. Now, of course, in a few moments you don't notice much, but something is happening. And part of the mindfulness practice is really being able to see with greater clarity the fine, subtle, nuanced changes that are taking place always. And so the apple revealed itself as it became brown, like leaves turning from green to brown, even in the course of a couple of hours. Had we been able to maintain our attention on it, we would almost be able to see it turning brown, but of course it's so subtle that we tend not to, like a watched pot. We don't really sort of notice as it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and also can have an interesting relationship to time, which we also talked about in class, those 3 minutes for those of you who were there, and the ways that we want to really be attentive to the unfolding of life moment by moment by moment, so we could really have the passage of time feel and perhaps be more satisfying, not too fast, not too slow, but another conversation for another time. But importantly, when we attend to the breath, there's something happening. There's something not only to feel, but there's also even a deeper level of things coming, things going. When we attend to the apple, there is a more obvious, in the ways that we tend to notice it, change taking place. And so part of what the class on Friday was very much oriented towards was including or adding to the mindfulness practice this idea that we really are paying attention to something that's happening, that's interesting, that's meaningful, and that we tend to miss. And then when you lift your eyes up from the breath or from the apple and you look around you, you see that everywhere. You see change happening everywhere, all the time. And very importantly, here too, the thoughts we have, the feelings, the sensations in the body, they come and they go. Even the beliefs we have come and go. And if you watch a mediation, you will see beliefs come up, you'll have statements come up, and if it's done effectively and if they're reactive, you will see them soften, you'll see them change. And this too, with our own internal process. And we notice that when we practice. We notice the arising of thoughts and the passing away of thoughts. One of the last things, I guess, with Evan Rock that this reminds me of that some of you noted and I thought was very insightful. One of you in class made the comment that we are not our thoughts. That thoughts are impermanent. They come and they go. Who knows the next thought you're going to have in 2 seconds? And is it going to be that same thought going to be there in a minute? Probably not. The line was on page 352. A result of practicing mindfulness meditation is the realization that a person's thoughts are not the same thing as that person. And that, of course, moves into that very domain and sets up its own very interesting conversation. All right, Daniel Bowling. I think the essence of Daniel Bowling's piece, Bring Peace into the Room for us, is this. One, that when we do look at the traditional mediation context of two people with a dispute and a mediator coming in to help it, hopefully a neutral, impartial mediator, and perhaps one for whom the mindfulness practice can be helpful, that really there's three people in the room, that this is a system. It's not like there are these two and I'm here to, but rather there's a relationship among three people, if that's the number of people in the room, and that's very, very important to understand. Of course, when we take the three-part process that we've explored of two people with a mediator, two people, one of whom is their own mediator, and one person mediating among themselves, that becomes obvious. But I think it's also the case, and Daniel Bowling points it out in this piece. And actually, I should say Daniel Bowling and David Hoffman. Also, he talks about drawing on another writer, suggesting that successful mediators are empathic, non-judgmental, patient, persuasive, optimistic, persistent, trustworthy, intelligent, creative, and flexible. And really, these are zeroing in on the kinds of traits that mindfulness practice is found to help cultivate and develop. He then goes on to speak to the Hawthorne Effect. I think this is very interesting. He says, a useful analogy for the process we are describing comes from the social sciences in a phenomenon known as the Hawthorne Effect, a term used to describe the changes people make in their behavior when they realize they are being observed. Now think about that. When they realize they're being observed. What are we doing when we're practicing mindfulness? Whether it's ourselves and we're caught in some struggle, whether we're in a conversation with somebody else, if we bring mindful awareness, if we intentionally seek to be more mindfully aware in that moment, then we are doing what? We are observing, right, in a more deliberate way than we might otherwise have been, and perhaps in a more dispassionate, though still caring, neutral, though still engaged way. He says, the term, oh, I'm sorry, I moved on to the next one. Okay, then he speaks to the mediator's presence. This brings us to the heart of our thesis, he says. There are certain qualities that the mediator's presence brings to the mediation process that exert a powerful influence and enhance the impact of the interventions employed by the mediator. He says the term presence, of course, has at least two meanings here. The fact that the mediator is physically present. So, by the way, when you're practicing mindfulness and your mind is somewhere else, as we explored, it's like you're no longer really even physically present, even though you are. So there's that piece to really be, and that's the attending to the sensations in the body, to the breath, to really steady ourselves in this body, to be physically present, and the qualities that his or her physical presence brings into the room. It is the second meaning that we are interested in as we explore how the mediator's presence influences the mediation. And so while Daniel Bowling certainly, in the article that you have to read for you this week, talks about meditation and the mindfulness practice, we can see how if we can truly be present and how mindfulness can help us move in that direction, we can more fully have a presence that is felt and is helpful to ourselves and to those who are in the room. On page 40, and I think this is the last comment I have to make on this particular piece, on page 40, there may be one more, he says, the personal qualities of the mediator thus affect his or her ability to sort through the clutter of emotions, accusation, and recrimination that the parties bring to the table, right? So the personal qualities that the mediator brings can affect their ability to sort through the clutter of emotions, accusations, and recriminations. And this is a reminder of the spiral, right? And how it is that the more practiced we are in mindfulness, the more that those spirals, they're not going to go away, but we're more skillful in working with them. He says these same qualities help the mediator envision an integration of the parties' interests. So imagine your own interest, an integration of your own interest, an integration of your interest in relationship to another person, and of course facilitating and being helpful to the integration of the parties' interests, And as you might imagine, when a mediation is meaningful and is satisfying, the mediator too leaves the room feeling some of that. And if it's not so satisfying and meaningful, the mediator too leaves the room perhaps feeling that. So he says, why? Because once mediators can experience their own views of the dispute, again, think of these three different scenarios, as having a validity that is neither less nor greater than that of the parties, they can begin to feel comfortable relinquishing their own vision of the right way or the best way to resolve the dispute and abandon any intention of imposing that vision on the parties. So imagine, I think that there's some nice, that can be very clearly understood in terms of how a mediator gets out of the way of the parties resolving their own dispute. It also speaks to how we get out of our own way in resolving our own dispute. And what does that mean? We get out of our own way. This is part of what we're exploring together. And then lastly, on page 44, he says, developing these qualities, presence, authenticity, self-awareness, congruence, integration. He says developing these qualities is a process of time, intention, and discipline. And of course, if you think about our mindfulness practice, as well as all that we do in the law, it takes time, an intention that we bring that has us really there for the experience, and discipline. And it comes, in our view, not from intellectual inquiry or scholarship, but from experience. So, as a closing thought as it relates to these readings, even in the context of the mediator becoming a more effective mediator, and of course, this is not very different than the lawyer becoming a more effective lawyer, or the litigator becoming a more effective litigator, the transactional attorney becoming a more effective transactional attorney. You could replace so many of the words here and apply it to so many different contexts. He's saying not so much because of intellectual inquiry or scholarship. He's not saying that those aren't very, very important. But I think what he's suggesting is, or they're suggesting is that we've already got that. We don't need as much help with that piece of this puzzle. But from experience. And that's the piece, whether there's the experience of getting out and doing and learning from the process, or from the mindfulness perspective. And he refers, of course, in the next piece you'll be reading, to the importance of direct experience, to the experience of practice. All right, well, I hope you found this to be helpful, either for purposes of just reflecting on Friday's class, or in time as you're working on your paper and re-exploring some of these issues, to be able to use this video to help illuminate and refine and clarify some of the issues and topics that we're exploring together.